There we go. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see you all tonight. This is an exciting event. This is what kind of kicked off our work 3 years ago, and it's nice to touch base and check back in again here. Lots of familiar faces in the room. So here's how things are going to go tonight. We are going to show a 7-minute version of Jim Crow the North, which many of you have seen. This is a shortened version of that film, and it's just to re-ground us in what began a lot of this work. I also have the honor of presenting both Daniel Bergin and Rebecca Walker tonight, who after the 7-minute video are both going to chat about some of their work. Then per our usual Eastside Freedom Library format, we're going to do a brief question and answer session, go into breakout rooms, and then come back together and talk about how those breakout rooms went. So I just want to introduce first Dan Bergin, who is TPT's executive producer. He's the producer of Jim Crow the North, Out North, and many other films, and recently won a Silver Circle Emmy. So give a little round of applause to Dan. Presenting alongside Dan is Rebecca Walker, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, whose work is at the intersection of climate change, resiliency, housing, and combating green gentrification. She was recently the co-author of a study entitled Advancing Water Equity Demands New Approaches to Sustainability Science. And Rebecca is using a lot of maps and software to advance environmental justice and racial justice across the Twin Cities. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you'll give me just a moment, I will pull up this film and hopefully everyone can see it. Hang tight. All right, here we go. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear the sound.
A new survey finds Minneapolis and St. Paul among the worst places for Black Americans to call home.
The racial inequity in this state is horrific.
When we think about wealth inequality in the United States today, that's directly attributable to problems associated with housing and denial of housing. The inability of African Americans to acquire wealth in the same way that other groups were able to, by virtue of having access to affordable housing, is one of the problems that impact those communities of color today.
About 75% of white families own the homes that they occupy. About 25% of black families own the homes that they occupy. It's actually the largest, in terms of percentage, gap in the country.
The major impediment to civil rights for African Americans' economic opportunity are these racially restrictive covenants, private contracts between individuals that allow them to dictate to whom they'll sell their property.
Covenants exist across the country. In Minneapolis, the covenants were first put in 1910. At that point, developers could start buying up large sections of farmland that adjoin the city.
When they start selling off the individual lots, that's really when the racial covenants kind of injected into the property record.
Racial covenants tells you who can or cannot live, lease, even occupy certain spaces. 100% of these covenants are aimed at African Americans.
The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining. Blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best. So areas that were predominantly African American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual.
In a lot of ways, the practice of redlining, which didn't start until the 1930s, institutionalized and spread racial covenants all over the country because suddenly developers got sanctioned, they got direction from the federal government saying, this is best practices.
Our community was redlined. Simple as that. Now, as a community, we made the best of it, and we produced a great many influential people as well. And a lot of that came from having developed a pretty powerful community. Fourth Avenue was now referred to as Crack Avenue. Up and down Fourth Avenue throughout the neighborhood, there were tough times.
This very persistent myth that northern cities never had formal segregation. The South had Jim Crow, and look at those signs. Well, racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
So even though covenants are now illegal, kind of this yawning chasm of wealth inequality that emerged as a result of covenants is still very much with us today. Identifying racial covenants, however, has proved remarkably challenging. The only way to find racial covenants are to read warranty deeds. We're looking at about 3 million deeds in Hennepin County between 1900 and 1960, and each deed on average runs about 3 pages. So we're in the ballpark of 10 million or so pages of text. So what we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is we're using digital tools to help us identify the deeds that do contain racially restrictive covenants. We ask volunteers to help us transcribe them. And those answers I then export, and this actually gives me enough data to build the map. There's actually 2 categories. It's business, industrial, and undeveloped.
With this data set that the Mapping Prejudice team has built, we asked the question, how have racial covenants affected present-day socioeconomic outcomes?
And the results that we find are that covenants were a way to lift the house prices by keeping people of certain races and colors out. What we find is a causal link between covenants in the past and 3 present-day socioeconomic outcomes. We find that houses that were covenanted in the past have, on average, 15% higher house values today compared to houses that were not covenanted. We also find that covenanted areas have lower African American residents and lower African American home ownership rates compared to areas within Minneapolis that did not have covenants.
I think it can make very powerful arguments about how can we reframe contemporary policy through more of an equity lens to help mitigate some of this damage that's resulted from racial covenants.
And I want everyone with this map to imagine themselves in this landscape of privilege and disenfranchisement.
So before I pass it over to Dan, I also want to mention that Kevin Erman Solberg, who's featured in that film, passed away unexpectedly last summer. And so it's really been an honor to show this film in the community and continue to honor his memory. And I don't think Dan or Peter know this, but the room, Dan, that you filmed Kevin in at the University of Minnesota was where I worked on my undergraduate thesis, which had to do with immigration. I studied the east side of St. Paul, ended up at the East Side Freedom Library. So it's interesting how all that's connected. So I'll pass it over to you, and you should have co-hosting capabilities if you have some slides.
Cool. Well, thanks, Ben. Yeah, Rebecca, I don't know about you or some of you all in the room, but I haven't watched the film since losing Kevin. So, that was it's always great to see him. He was just such a kind of a fierce warrior. and advocate and just tireless, first person I ever interviewed, black or white, I think, to use reparations in a real intentional way. And so thank you for kind of just pointing that out. I mean, it's just a reminder that those of you all who do this work in movement work, we're human too. And that we, all the same things that affect and afflict folks, interestingly, on some of the issues, that we all work on. They affect us too. It's one of you mentioned the silver circle and the kind of recognition for my many, many years in public TV. If there's kind of an eerie side to that, it's that I've, in that time, inevitably, I kind of encounter or experience, or in my family and circles, all the issues that, that I've been trying to lift up: mental health, opiate addiction, poverty, racism, and all its effects. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of just have us all kind of appreciate Kevin and his work, which lives on, obviously, in this work, the work you all are doing. So what an amazing legacy. So, sorry, I hope that was, it's just important. So yeah, it's also interesting to watch that short piece that I did, kind of reversion for the PBS initiative called Retro Report, which, as we all believe in, was kind of this, what's the history behind today's headlines. So I've always, as Peter knows, I've always tried to do that in my history work and make it, explicit, even in terms of the relevance and connection, in a not very Ken Burns way, when even some of my colleagues were like, what's with all the contemporary, people and footage in these histories? And that's why. And so Retro Report was a case in point to do that. But I did this additional interview, as like with Rebecca, who we'll hear from in a little bit, other scholars and activists and researchers were starting to add on and build out the work that Kirsten and Kevin and Penny and the team had started. And so in that case, it was these economics students, high-level researchers who, nicely boiled down for me to understand some of what they were doing in their preliminary research. And so I included that in that update. As you probably, or if you've seen the film, that wasn't in the documentary, but it's kind of some of the things that were starting to come as a result of the Mapping Prejudice movement and Jim Crow of the North helping to amplify that. It was also around the time where we were at the state legislature at the Capitol for a ceremonial signing of the bill that Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan signed, that what made real the years really of work by Mapping Prejudice and some of their political allies and others to create this bipartisan legislature that allowed people to expunge or discharge the racist deed in their covenant. And I haven't looked at that footage in a while, but I remember, the governor even kind of like, not off mic, but, he was like, whoa, have you seen the language in some of these deeds? Like, just that impact that it's had on all of us when we kind of realized that. And him and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan both kind of making comments about, like, words matter and this is real and it has impact today. So, and so, just that kind of ripple of this work continued. And I will try and share my screen just to kind of show how what we're trying to do at TPT now is to kind of follow along with some of those ripples and some of the ways that the work of Mapping Prejudice and this kind of historiography and these narratives are still happening. Research is still happening. And I love the idea of storytelling that kind of draws the veil and shows and demystifies the scholarship. And that's like what you all do at the Eastside Freedom Library, is everyone can be a scholar and we all should, and it can really make change. So stories like that are ones that we're interested in a kind of an ongoing digital first series, which will be basically short documentaries, that will be on YouTube long before they might be on broadcast on TPT, but that still kind of followed this theme of race, place, and the past. And also in that kind of lifting up strength-based narrative, something that, I would have liked to have done more in Jim Crow of the North too. So as I mentioned, the kind of the things that have happened, the kind of spread of the research into Ramsey County and St. Paul and in other places and with other partners is something that we're kind of following along and documenting, and just now starting to kind of shape these into stories. But as many of you know, one of the cool things that came out of the discharge legislation was our friends in Golden Valley actually started this really cool movement called Just Deeds. And so it was, really was one of the things that we were curious about. And I know Kirsten and the team has always, when they started seeing it happen, they were really encouraged, is that, at least at the municipal level, sometimes on the county level, and then some of this at the state, that lawmakers, urban planners, policymakers were kind of reckoning with this and starting to see how they could actually fold it into policy and planning. But Just Deeds is a really dynamic example of that. For me, in part because it wasn't Minneapolis or St. Paul, it was, Golden Valley. And so, we interviewed the founder of Just Deeds. This is your producer point of view snapshot of Maria Cisneros, who was the city attorney in Golden Valley. And she really, along with others, eventually a lot of partners, kind of initiated this really amazing project where they are helping folks, first of all, identify if a house has a restrictive covenant, and then help them go through the not uncomplicated process to discharge the deed, and not cheap either. But she's a city attorney. She's also a homegirl from the West Metro, and kind of talked about that in our interview about, growing up, her having that same sense that, many of us have had about why are there no people of color, or not many, in this community. One thing I'll share with you all, because a lot of the work you do is with policymakers, is Maria's it just seems like she's doing a great job of, this balance of clearly being involved in real change work, not shying away from calling out systemic racism, even in her community, surfacing some really interesting history actually that we'll share in the story. But also, kind of understanding that she's a city attorney, she's got to work with policymakers of different political stripes. And so it's kind of been, watching her is kind of a cool example of how the diplomacy that's involved in trying to kind of tip some of this into action in spaces that aren't Minneapolis City Hall, City Council. And so, sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide here. I don't know, I might have lost control of my screen. Ben, do I still have co-hosting powers?
You should. One moment here.
Let's see, I'm getting a kind of an error prompt. It looks like we've got some more folks in the waiting room, but okay, let's see. All right, thank you. So one of the other things that kind of spiraled out of just this general movement, but also Just Deeds, was a really cool art project that many of you are probably familiar with, that my friend and fellow Southsider Diver Van Avery initiated with a cool group of artists. And this was the Just Deeds. So, we have Free the Deeds and this is Free the Deeds, that was Just Deeds. I will share with you all on the brainstorming for the title of Jim Crow of the North before I just settled on Penny Peterson's just brilliant soundbite where she called it what it is. Just in a, kind of in brainstorming, you just put ideas down. I think I did put Dirty Deeds down at one point and thinking of the old rock song or something. But so the Deeds titles continue. And in this case, it's a really awesome art project. Diver has done a lot of art engagement work, certainly here on the South Side, and I've done some of that with her, just on a very kind of South Side, South Central level, certainly with the queer and BIPOC community that is so centered here in our neighborhood. But this sublime idea of having lawn signs call out that, a restrictive covenant is present in this house, and that those lawn signs are kind of created by artists. So Diver and their team kind of got this going. They work with Just Deeds. And so we're kind of following that story, and we're filming with them last summer, and joined them at National Night Out and visited a couple neighborhoods where the Free the Deeds team was at, with computers, kind of talking to people about their homes, having them check to see if there's a restrictive covenant, signing them up for a lawn sign. And then if they are able to pay for that lawn sign, that goes to a Black homeownership housing fund with the City of Lakes Land Trust. So cool, creative, change-making art, but real change and real reparations in the Free the Deeds project. So this is actually video of, and that's Diver at the computer. That's my crew documented it, and they're signing up folks, and just kind of have this mobile ability to kind of have people learn about the restrictive covenants and then take action in real time. And then as part of the project too, you know, and this, I really dig this because it's this idea again of asset frame and strength-based narratives in the midst of, you know, uncovering systemic racism and white supremacy, is my man, Mike Hoyt, another great Southsider and a kind of change maker and just a wonderful artist. The Free the Deeds project had Mike pictured here. We were documenting him in his Dreams Land art space in South Central, right next to the Columbus Gardens, the longtime community garden over in the Central neighborhood. So they had Mike create these wonderful portraits of Black homeowners, one South Side family, one North Side family, and they're large scale and stunning. And so that's kind of woven into the Free the Deeds project. And they would have these posters of these paintings, you know, at farmers markets and other places where they were engaging with people. And then as part of this, it's a complicated story to tell and we're still wrestling with it, because another facet to this is the awesome artist and poet Juana Sullivan is doing oral histories. And so we kind of came alongside the Free the Deeds Oral History Project, brought the crew, here in this case, crammed into Louis Moore's house over on the South Side and documented that in real-time oral history conversation that Juana led with Louis Moore and his wife. You all may know Mr. Moore. He's a longtime presence on the South Side, one of the founders of the Major Taylor Bike Club, and a real kind of Black wellness advocate, kind of a park leader, park rec coach, MLK football teams for years and years. But here's just a little clip, not of our high-level videography, but of my just mobile phone capture of, if you listen closely, you'll hear them telling the story of looking for their house.
He really was discouraging at big time. You know, oh, I got this place on 37th, I got this place on 35th. I really would like, that kind of stuff.
But never came out and said,
no.
Why?
No. And never tried to interest us in anything other than beyond that point on 38.
So the geography of red lines and kind of racist barriers in South Minneapolis is, you know, south of 38th, you were starting to get into the kind of perceived white space. And then ultimately you get to 46 and Columbus and you get to where the Lees moved and you get the kind of the lynch mob that surrounded their house in the early 30s. So the Moores experienced that. And one of the things I was excited about capturing this story, because I knew it, Mr. Moore had told it to me, was, you know, Jim Crow of the North didn't have more of those kind of lived experience stories of Black folks trying to find home. And in this case, well, I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's just kind of cool how they ended up getting this home. But it wasn't because of the realtor, I'll tell you that. But I know Cian is here, and so it's so cool now that we've got, you know, realtors in the movement. But in this case, the Moores kind of we're fighting a couple systems, you know, including, you know, having a cooperative blocking realtor. So I'll stop sharing my screen and stop talking. And but that's, so anyway, just to summarize the stories of Jim Crow of the North that we're kind of working on now. We're hoping to start rolling some of them out this summer, but also do it intentionally with engagement and experience and action. And so I'd love it, and Katie and I have been talking about, you know, it'd be wonderful if you all in your movement and the Eastside Freedom Library might be a place to kind of bring these stories and kind of take in narrative and then take action. So I'll stop there and then pass the mic to Rebecca, and then maybe we can do questions after.
Cool. Okay, it was so great to hear about that, and I think that intersects. There are a lot of intersections with what I want to talk about, and so thank you for queuing it up so nicely. So yeah, thanks for letting me be part of this conversation. I'm a PhD student studying housing and the environment and urban planning. And I always try and say too much anytime I get a chance to present about anything, and I'm going to try really hard to not do that, but bear with me. So there are three buckets of work that I wanted to mention and sort of bring to this conversation that we're having tonight. First is some of that work that Dan mentioned, where we're really taking this mapping prejudice map and saying, what questions can we ask next with this data? And so some of my work has looked at how those developers of racial covenants interacted with the Minneapolis Park Board to really not only create some of the disparities in homeownership and wealth, but also this landscape of environmental injustice in Minneapolis. I also want to bring the conversation to the present and talk a little bit about gentrification and also sort of like the rise of corporate landlords. I think that when I'm thinking about racial disparities in homeownership today, those are the two things that I'm really thinking about. And so I'll talk a little bit about both of those for a quick second and maybe mention a bit about how they interact with my work in terms of looking at the urban environment. And then finally, I'm really excited to share this like really hot off the presses study that we just finished collecting data on, looking at how planners in the Twin Cities are using the mapping prejudice data on racial covenants and their planning decisions, and sort of the new windows of opportunity that data set is opening up for planners. And so I want to talk a little bit about that too, because I think that it's really exciting and makes me feel hopeful. Okay, so I mentioned already, the first thing I want to talk about is this research on the parks. So the Mapping Prejudice team has done a ton of research to show how racial covenants were used to create racial disparities in access to home ownership. We just saw Jim Crow of the North, condensed version. And so I'm gonna try and share screen, technology. And so I'm gonna show, this one. Just some maps, if I can find it. All right. What are you guys seeing? Are you guys seeing a map right now? Nah, it's cool, great. I'm sorry, I'm still so bad at Zoom. So if you look at this map, the red on the map are obviously the racial covenants in Minneapolis. And then I have the park system shown on the map. And sort of the lighter green parks are parks that are older than racial covenants, and the bright green parks are the parks that opened during the era in which racial covenants were used. So that's 1910 to 1950. And just like a really quick glance at this map, where you see red, you also see that bright green. And so these investments in parks are really following where there's this, the racial covenants creating this exclusive white space. And in my research, I wanted to understand, how did this happen? And so we identified 3 ways that this is happening. In some instances, we see the park board, like they'll announce a new park, and then immediately developers will go in and they'll buy up all the land around the park, and then they'll add racial covenants to it. And that was really seen as a strategy for creating like high value properties, as this combination of greenness and whiteness. And then the other main mechanism that we see is developers buying land and then developing part of it for housing, adding racial covenants to all of that land, and then donating the rest of the land to the park board to build a new park. So they weren't even following the investments. They were saying, here you go, park board, here's a new park that you're going to have in my neighborhood that has been made exclusively white by virtue of these racial covenants. And then they really use these investments in the parks to sell these properties in these neighborhoods. So this is probably an advertisement that you all have seen if you've engaged with Mapping Prejudice's work, but this is from one of Edmund Walton's real estate developments. And it's an ad in the newspaper, and you see in the language of the advertisement, he includes the racial restrictions. And so clearly those racial restrictions were part of his marketing strategy. But if you also look at the map, he includes Lake of the Isles, and he's showing the park space, and he's showing the trees, and he's showing this lagoon that's right next to this development. And just a few years prior to running this ad, he had purchased this land, including that area where the lagoon is now, which was at that time swampland. And then he donated it to the park board so that they could then build this canal connecting Lake of the Isles to Cedar Lake. And he really did that intentionally to make these properties more valuable. And so that's some of the work that I've started doing using that Mapping Prejudice map. And I'm talking about parks, but I think that really shows us something about how this racism that's happening on a private level becomes structural, right? Like we see the privilege that's then afforded to these neighborhoods by virtue of these developers who are putting the racial covenants onto these properties. And then you see how this racism gets built into the built infrastructure of our cities. And so that's that pool of work that I I'm excited to talk about some more. I want to also talk a little bit about what's going on today. I think, just as Dan said, thinking about how history informs how we understand what's happening in our housing market today and in our society today. So in the study that just came out that I think is really fantastic from the Urban Institute, and also with folks at the Alliance and Cura at the university and a bunch of other housing organizations, that's really looking at trends in home ownership in the Twin Cities, and they identify two big forces that are leading to actually a worsening of the gap in home ownership between white folks and non-white folks. And those really are gentrification and sort of the rise of corporate landlords. And I think that we're probably both, or we're like generally familiar with what those are, but gentrification really builds on this legacy of redlining and disinvestment, where then property investors will come in and they'll see areas with low rents and they'll see the potential to make a profit. And through both public and private investment, we see these neighborhoods that were historically often low income and neighborhoods of color become gentrified, and we see new white homeowners moving into these neighborhoods. And similarly, as to we saw with the racial covenants, they're often using parks and investments in the environment to really sell these neighborhoods and sort of make this gentrification process happen. So some of my work has looked at that in Minneapolis, looking at how the city is really using investments in green infrastructure as part of their urban renewal process that really has led to a lot of gentrification. And I think that we see that in some of the community organizing around the Upper Harbor Terminal project, where folks are quite concerned that this big investment that's really being led by developers in the city and the park board in this new park space is going to lead to the gentrification and displacement of what is a largely Black and other people of color neighborhood surrounding that site. And so I think that that's a really important area to be thinking about and talking about. And then in terms of the corporate landlords, we saw after the recession and the foreclosure crisis, these large national and international companies coming in and buying up housing stock. And really, particularly in neighborhoods that were predominantly people of color, and that's because the predatory lending really targeted particularly Black women for those predatory mortgages. And so it's building on this like many decades of racialized wealth extraction. And now we have corporate landlords coming in, buying up these homes and converting them to rental properties. And so instead of these homes being an avenue for wealth building, they're really becoming an avenue for wealth extraction in these neighborhoods. And some of my work is looking at how that intersects with climate resiliency and our ability to be prepared for the changes that climate change is going to bring in those neighborhoods. And then, oh boy, finally, there's too much on the screen, so I'm just going to tell you about it before I switch to it. But we just interviewed a lot of planners who are now using the mapping prejudice data set in their work. And we talked to them about how this changed sort of their understanding of structural racism and also sort of the policy outcomes that have come from it. And we had many planners tell us that this was the first time that they really understood structural racism was after engaging with the mapping prejudice data set, that they have been using mapping prejudice's data set as a narrative tool to push more policies that are redistributive or have an equity, to increase the need to do equity-oriented policies in their city planning. There were a whole host of different policies that people talked about on this spectrum, from policies aimed at recognition and really trying to own up for this history of racial covenants towards more redistributive policies, including people talking about reparations for the first time and saying this data set on racial covenants is a way that we could actually start enacting reparations, because we can start to put numbers to this racial wealth gap, and we can start thinking about it in a serious way. And there are also lots of housing policies, like the elimination of single family zoning. We also talked about land trusts. There's the City of Lakes Community Land Trust is starting an African American community land trust. mortgage assistance for folks, all of these different policies to try and really bridge that gap in access to homeownership. And so that was really exciting work. And I think it really shows this long legacy that the mapping prejudice has had, that it's not just mapping covenants, but it's really like shaping how we understand our cities and housing in our cities. And that's all I have. And I, I hope I didn't talk for far too long.
No, that was totally great. Let's open up for some question and answer. There we go. If you want to raise your hand, let's see, we could use the raise hand feature to ask questions, or you can pop them in the chat. I see that, Kate, you raised your hand, so why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, everybody. I'm really grateful for the work that folks have been doing in this area. And I guess I'm wondering too, has anybody been working on the racism that's embedded in credit scores, you know, for folks to be able to qualify for loans? And the Forbes did a report on how racism is built into those credit scores, and just wondering if there has been work on that. But I just really appreciate I'm learning a lot about what has been going on, and just appreciate the work that you've been doing.
You know, I appreciate you asking that. Years ago, I did a project called Living with a Hole in Your Pocket. And it was done with Northwest Area Foundation, who are interested in wealth development and communities, especially indigenous and diverse communities. But I was pushing at that. To me, it's always seemed like this kind of artifice, and it seemed just innately unequal and oppressive and hard to get out from under. And so with this theme of the catch-22s of poverty that so many of us get caught in, I managed to get a little bit of reflection on that with a woman who was a homeowner and, you know, had a lot of equity in her home, but couldn't tap into it because of a bad credit score. You know, the documentary was like a series of those kind of brutal catch-22s. But you're right, it doesn't get talked about enough. One cool innovation that I learned about was initiatives to try and get things like lending circles and other things that in traditional cultural communities and in home countries, you know, there's kind of lending circle culture that's very innate and native to a lot of our cultures outside, you know, where we come from and not here. And so some innovations and some work to try and get something that like a Latinx community's lending circle to kind of see that as something to measure and to include in a credit score. But I'm so glad you mentioned that, because all this about homeownership and equity and wealth development is kind of moot if you can't, you know, leverage it for that college tuition or whatever. It's a good question.
And what people pay for their housing rent, that should be counted first in the credit score. Mm-hmm.
Totally.
Well, we've got a deck of questions that we could go through, but I don't want to bring them up until everyone else has a chance to go ahead. So I'll give you a moment more. If you have I see Cian, you raised your hand, go ahead. Keeping it real in real estate. So your turn.
Thanks. Thank you, Ben. And what a wonderful presentation. I'm so glad I'm here tonight. I would like to just comment on Kate O'Connell's question. And there is some real movement today in the mortgage industry to start using on-time rent payments as a part of the credit building portfolio, and to use what we term quasi types of credit, such as your cellular phone bill, your internet bill, toward, you know, on-time payments of them toward your credit score. And that's happening at the level of HUD, and it's happening you know, around the country in lots of places to really address the inequities that are baked into our credit scoring system. So that's happening and it's moving forward.
So I've got a question. This one's kind of aimed at you, Rebecca. So could you speak for a moment about how housing policies have also coincided with industrial parts of the city? You look at North Minneapolis with the Herc generator, or even the Hillcrest development over here on the east side, which is slated for light industrial. It seems like, redlining and industrialization and being as far away from parks as possible seems to coincide quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's sort of the flip of the work that I've done. So not only were there all these strategies by both the city and the real estate market to really hoard these spaces of environmental privilege and the exclusive white neighborhoods, but where our industrial development is largely regulated by city zoning, right? So the city was zoning particular areas for industrial growth and industrial development. And those were neighborhoods that were redlined that had populations of people of color in them. And so I think if we look back at the history of those zoning maps, it was intentional. It was intentional that we're going to put these spaces that we don't want near our neighborhoods, like our being white neighborhoods, in these communities. And communities of color are dealing with that today. I mean, I'm thinking about the north side again. You mentioned Herc, and so if you're there and you're like looking at the Herc site, so that is just on the other side of the neighborhood from where the Upper Harbor Terminal development is. So there are all these spaces that have been exposed to these really high levels of pollution. And now when we're starting to see like some cleanup and some new investment in green spaces, that's not corresponding with city investments and affordable housing at a rate, or things like community benefits agreements or property tax freezes, the kinds of things that would keep people in place and allow them to enjoy the benefits of maybe environmental cleanup that environmental justice activists are really pushing for, and also enjoy those new investments in green space that are happening there. So those are definitely super intertwined and really part of the same process as I see it.
I've got Peter, and then I have two different questions in the chat I'll bring up after you go, Peter.
Recently, I've seen mention of studies about trees and the presence or absence of trees in certain neighborhoods, and trees that are planted by the city, and the impact that then has on temperature. Too hot in certain parts of the city. I wonder, Rebecca, if your work at the intersection of climate and housing, if there's anything you can add about trees, the kinds of things that we take for granted, or like God planted the trees. But please go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, something that I think is so fascinating about studying that question in the Twin Cities in particular. So I come from the East Coast where you can just imagine like, oh, all the trees, they've always been here. But in the Twin Cities, this is prairie. There weren't trees all over the place. And in fact, like most of the trees, someone planted them. Someone was like, I want a tree here. And so when we're thinking about where there are and aren't trees, it's really purposeful. And yeah, so some of the work that we've done has been overlaying the redlining maps, which a lot of folks have done, and seeing, okay, like where there was lots of tree canopy is also those areas that were given an A rating, and the areas that were redlined have much lower tree canopy. And then unsurprisingly, if we look at the covenants map, you see really similar things, that areas that had covenants also have more tree cover. And I think that there are like a lot of things going on. I suspect, and I know some from my archival research, that the same thing that we see happening with the parks, where not only are getting these big green spaces, but the people who lived in those wealthier, whiter neighborhoods had more sway with the park board, with the city, with the officials who are making decisions about where we're investing this money. and then they got more public investment in trees. And I think one of the ways that that feels like it's perpetuated today, and that I've been thinking a lot about, are these private organizations like Friends of So-and-so Park, or like these neighborhood organizations that that corral this public or private money to fund public goods, like to pay for street trees or to pay for park improvements. And so if you already have a lot of wealth, then you can put it back into your public space and keep building wealth that way.
That's a key point. The boulevard trees are descendants from park board planning too. So it's not just in park space. The boulevards, which are so much of the canopy that we think of. And you make a good point, Rebecca. It was kind of a revolutionary act in mid-century when the Minneapolis Park Board actually tried to pull back a little bit from the inequities of your neighborhood gets the assessment if you want a park. So you could imagine who got parks, who got park amenities. And so there actually was a real intentional effort at the time when when Minneapolis city government could kind of get things done in a different way that was, for its time, was kind of revolutionary. But so that a Luxton Park, maybe a North Commons could get, could get access to resources to do their rec center, because rec centers were rare. Now they're ubiquitous, and you can't imagine a park really without one. But that had to be fought for, and it was change that had to happen 80 years into the park board's existence. But I will say, just in defense of some of the visionaries of the parks, because that wasn't, I don't know Horace Cleveland well, but he was about, kind of green space for wellness for the workers and the immigrants, maybe not everybody, he wasn't invoking everybody, but it was kind of perverted by the city, founders and fathers and the robber barons and the capitalists. But because Cleveland was the one who came here and said, you need to protect that river, and you could do something with this chain of lakes, and you should have a park within 5 blocks of everyone in this city. But that, some of that esprit, I think, was lost with what your research, Rebecca, is uncovering about, the landowners and the park founders.
So I've got a question in the chat again for Rebecca. Could you tell us a little bit more about how your work on climate resiliency relates with this history of redlining, or this discussion in general?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that some of that is like Peter's question already touched on. So when we're thinking about how climate change is going to change our cities, I think one of the big things that we're talking about are where people are exposed to extreme heat. And so if we have inequities and where there's tree canopy cover, where there's green space, those things are things that keep our cities cool and cool things down. And even just, so I live pretty in sort of central Minneapolis, and when I have walked during the summer from central to the lakes, and you can just feel block by block, it gets cooler and cooler as you get closer to those green spaces. And so those spaces that have lower tree canopy cover because of things like redlining and racial covenants today are more vulnerable to these changes from climate change. And then the other point that I'll make that's maybe one of these contemporary manifestations of inequality in the housing market, if you have a neighborhood where a ton of the properties have been bought up by national or international landlords, those landlords aren't making investments in those properties to make them more climate resilient, right? They're not there on the ground. They're not making them more energy efficient. They're not providing good heating or cooling. They're not planting trees or maintaining trees. And so it makes us harder as a city when most trees in a city are planted on private land. If that private land is owned by someone a million miles away, they're not here helping us make that more resilient to climate change and helping the communities that live there respond to our changing cities.
I think that's a great point. Even over here on the east side, I've noticed over the last couple of years, a house will go up for sale from a mortgage company that's not local, and all the trees are taken down instantly around the house, to make it sell better. And it's something I see. I mean, there's just right next to the Freedom Library, there's a house where that happened. So that's a real thing. Kim asked, can you both speak a little bit more about how reparations intersect with racial covenants and how that might work?
I can jump in some, and Dan, I'd love for you to add as well. So just in terms of the interviews we were doing, this came up in a really specific way, where because of the Fair Housing Act, and this is a good thing, we can't make allocations in terms of housing and lending based on race. But what some of the folks we were talking to were saying was we can't make allocations based on race, but we can say if you're a descendant of this group that was discriminated by this policy, you are eligible for this assistance. And that's how people were starting to frame reparations, and particularly relative to racial covenants. So I know that that on a citywide level, the city of Burlington, Vermont was trying to do exactly this. They were trying to map the racial covenants, figure out what the racial wealth gap was that resulted from this, and then start a reparations program based on that.
I'm actually curious what's happening in St. Paul. I feel like you all are ahead of certainly your sister city. And so how's your movement supporting some of that work with the mayor and others?
Well, I think I saw Rashad sneak in here. Rashad, do you want to talk about that for a moment if you're willing to?
Hi, everyone. Sure. Yeah, I can say a few words about it. And really just only a few, because the process is actually ongoing. So they have a reparations legislative advisory committee, which was produced by resolution at the city council level. So the mayor doesn't actually have any direct involvement with it at this point in time. They are in the process of working out what the Community Reparations Recovery Act will actually look like. But the goal is to establish a permanent citywide commission in the case of St. Paul. So we'll have to wait and see. In Minneapolis, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, similarly, put forth by the city council, which I think from what we know now has led to something like a community-wide dialogue series or something like that, where I assume the city council reaches out to community organizations that are capable or have some history with or experience with hosting cross-cultural interracial dialogues. Not quite sure, but that's all we know at this point. So this is the subject of my dissertation, so to give some context.
Thanks for
so that's it.
In there.
Yeah, sorry. That's it. Yeah.
So maybe we'll take one more question and then go into breakout groups. Okay, I've got one. Dan, how do you feel like Jim Crow the North has, catalyzed change in the Twin Cities? I know you touched on it with the deeds work, but how else have you experienced that? And I have an anecdote that I'll add to.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to hear it. It has been interesting. Even, the film came out in the winter of 2019, and there was a lot of cool tension and conversation, thanks to Mapping Prejudice and then to the community who were kind of bringing Kirsten and I and others in for conversations. A lot of faith-based spaces too. But then obviously after George Floyd was murdered, that kind of went to a different level and a different kind of tone of conversation. So Ben, selfishly, and Kirsten would probably say the same, and a lot of her colleagues like Rebecca, I've been really fortunate to be in a lot of these conversations and spaces. It's been interesting to see, it's often, diverse, but often white space. It's been, the phrase, Rashad, truth and reconciliation, and thinking about South Africa and that kind of intense form of processing this kind of history and trauma and inequity, and then how do you kind of repair? And so that's been, powerful and sublime in little ways, and then being in Black space, it's kind of a different energy where there's, maybe a sense of, we knew this already, but thank you. And we're glad others are learning too, but we also are glad you're lifting up some of our sheroes and heroes in this century-long fight, because we knew about it. It isn't like we needed a new research project or a film to know about this for the most part. So yeah, it's been really powerful, again, selfishly, just to kind of be able to witness and be a part of real conversations. And because I'm not about and here's the film and good night. It's really been cool how folks are like, and let's stick around for another hour to talk. And Kirsten Delegard from Matt Bridges and I are kind of looking at each other like, whoa, they ain't playing. We are really going to get into a conversation. So that's been cool. But what's your anecdote, Ben?
My anecdote is, we started the housing justice program shortly after we showed Jim Crow the North here at the Eastside Freedom Library. And a strategy we started to use on the East Side, I see Deacon Schneider's here. One thing that we did was we started partnering up with faith-based organizations and going in and showing Jim Crow the North. And we probably, Sydney and I, who run the housing justice program, I've lost track of how many times we've shown the film. I haven't memorized it yet, but I'm getting close, I think. And we've probably gone into maybe 8 different churches and shown it to several hundred people. And different kinds of conversations every time. Sometimes people, one time, Jane Henderson, who I don't think is here tonight, co-hosted showing the film with me at the Beloved Church on the East Side. And we showed the film at 6 o'clock and we're there until 10 o'clock because the conversation went in a really theological direction and it just went on and on and on. So it's been a wonderful tool to talk about this in our community on the East Side over here. So
thank you for that. Thanks for underscoring that idea of those faith spaces being one of the places that it needs to be accountable, where at least in our community, the movement's always kind of taken root and been catalyzed. And then now you all, like me, you probably, I'll be in the kind of hallway eating a cookie and then I hear like Josie Johnson, I'm like, oh, it's almost over. We're about to have the conversation. So you're probably getting to that mode too, where you're like, I know exactly where we are in the film at this point.
So let's go into breakout rooms. I'll open those up for about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and finish out for the night. And Peter, anyone there willing to share out how that went?
Well, all I know is there was a lot of wisdom and it wasn't coming from me. So just appreciate, the wisdom about bringing hope to our young people and building wealth through owning homes, but through other ways too. And trying to find, and other folks I know were speaking too, but it was really powerful to be in that room. And the young people who are not having it.
Anyone else from that room want to say anything? Or we'll go to the other room.
Yeah, I just wanted to amen that. It was a great discussion, and thanks for that time. And education came up as well, and the intersectionality of both oppressions, but also opportunity. We were talking about how for some of us, restrictive covenants are noticed or because they're manifest in our schools and our segregated schools and the kind of wide gaps we see in education as well. But I loved this theme we ended on with the sisters talking about like Black entrepreneurship. I just wanted to share a piece I did because you did make me think about here on the South Side, a really cool entrepreneur, one of our elders who, he wasn't Cap Wigington in that he designed these beautiful edifices and ice palaces, but Mr. Glanton built community literally, and the Spokesman Recorder Building is one example. So this is a little piece, a non-TPT piece that I did as part of my kind of South Side stories, just really little local histories here in South Central. But I wanted you to meet Mr. Glenn because he's an example of that, of not only, Black entrepreneurship and connecting and networking, but mentoring and passing it on and getting others kind of coming along behind you.
Katie, don't tell on Dan for sharing that. So the other group we had Bill Dorgan, Clarence, Hafsa, Kylie, Nicole, Philip, and Rebecca. Does anyone want to share out?
I don't know. Does anyone want to share out? we sort of talked about how, well, a few things, but, like we, started with the conversation around trees and planting trees, and there are like concrete effects of having trees planted, but just it sort of telecasts how policymakers and developers and planners want to cast the identity of certain spaces and areas and neighborhoods, and that it just doesn't happen with tree planting, but in so many other ways in which we define public and open spaces, whether they're parks or just open fields or whatever. There's an open field blocks away from where I live, and I never see anyone playing baseball or football on it. Why is that? What have we done? And that it's all been driven to, you have to pay a lot of money to participate or to have it even be a part of your consciousness and culture. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
I'll add, we had the importance of education came up in our group too, and really thinking about how our public schools telling these stories and our history, and really like looking at this history and having a frank conversation about Minneapolis and the Twin Cities and Minnesota's past. And so, yeah, I thought that was really important to hear in terms of how we make decisions going forward and really engage in our local politics going forward.
Well, any final thoughts from either group, and then we'll end for the night?
Just that politics requires more education and the realization of how complicated it is than we like to think about it. We think of it in terms, we usually intersect with it, once a year when it comes time to vote. The people talk about making legislation is like making sausage. But actually it's way more complicated than that. And it may be as ugly, but what you put in one end of the grinder is not even recognizable coming out the other end. And so many things happen along the way. And every step forward we want to take is complicated, not only by a very complicated process, but by opponents who we would never imagine would go to such great lengths to stymie anything that would give us life. It's like, we have to remember it was for a long time mostly in the South, but people were willing to shut down their schools for a year and a half, have no schools for their kids to go to for a year and a half, just so that their kids would not have to go to school with Black kids. And if someone would go to that extent to maintain that kind of supremacy, just think, we need to be aware that that is happening now where we live too. And, we can't be naive about that. We've had legislators in our building who have demonstrated that out loud. And it's a real thing.
Well, at the risk of appearing to counter my colleague and dear friend Clarence, I want to try to end on a positive note. And I'm still wrestling with Dan's use of the term strength-based narratives. And I think of his work as a filmmaker, my work as a teacher, others of you, your work as storytellers. How do we balance the analysis and revelation of, say, what we've learned tonight about how institutionalized racism works and all of these intersections between home ownership, trees, parks, schools, it can feel stifling to put all that out. And at the same time, the Mapping Prejudice Project that has been so intentionally participatory to get lots of people working on digging up the information and understanding the information and sharing the information. And the way that Jim Crow of the North has generated so many positive conversations where people have connected with people they might not have known before or understood before. And I think last week, when we had a program about police abolition, and most of the presentations became about what people are actually doing on the ground. And it wasn't just about, and today is another day to think about how awful the police are and this young brother who was shot and killed in Minneapolis. But all of this work that people are doing that the damn media in the United States typically does not. If you don't have your ear to the ground, you're not hearing these stories. And I think Dan is such a marvelous role model of what happens when we tell these stories. And I think his work and the work that we're trying to do at the East Side Freedom Library and that many of you are doing in many ways, we have to keep creating a platform for these strength-based narratives to be told, because they will inspire other people to carry on. And I continue to be an optimist, and and maybe it's easier being a white person to be an optimist, but it seems to me there's a lot of strength-based activity going on, and we need to put a spotlight on it and share it with other people. And I think that's been a lot of what tonight has been. So thank you, Ben and Sid, for your work putting this together.
Well, thank you, Dan and Rebecca. My shameless plug, since I'm not tired of hosting events, I love events, is next Tuesday I'm hosting another event that happens to be about what's going on with evictions in Minnesota. So I hope that you share that out. I put that in the chat because I think this conversation was really centered around home ownership and what's going on with the racial home ownership gap. And what we found through the housing justice program is there is an intrinsic relationship between tenants' rights and home ownership. And so we've moved in that direction to have those conversations too. So please join us for that. If you can't join us, please share it. And I'll look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.